So there was a meeting Donald Trump never knew about. At least, that's the story now circulating through financial circles, trade commentators, and political analysts trying to understand how a trade war that once appeared overwhelmingly tilted in Washington's favor may have entered an entirely new phase. No televised summit, no dramatic confrontation, no late-night emergency press conference, no triumphant declaration from a podium draped in national flags. Instead, if the accounts surrounding this agreement are to be believed, it happened quietly. A conference room in an unremarkable building, a handful of officials, a stack of legal documents, several signatures, and perhaps the most dangerous weapon in international negotiations, options. Because trade wars are rarely won the way politicians promise they will be. They don't end with one side waving a white flag. They don't end with a single speech. They don't end because someone tweets victory. Trade wars end when the mathematics change. And mathematics, unlike politics, has no loyalty. For 8 months, the economic relationship between the United States and Canada had been transformed into something neither country had experienced in generations. What began as targeted tariffs slowly evolved into a broader confrontation. Steel, aluminum, manufacturing, agriculture, energy, critical minerals. Every new round of restrictions created ripple effects that extended far beyond the politicians announcing them. Factories don't operate on political slogans. Supply chains don't care about election cycles. Investors don't allocate billions of dollars based on patriotic speeches. They calculate risk. They calculate cost. They calculate probability. And when the numbers stop making sense, they move. That is exactly what businesses on both sides of the border had begun to do. The tragedy of trade wars is that their first victims are rarely the people declaring them. They are ordinary workers. The parts manufacturer in Windsor who suddenly loses production volume because American buyers cannot predict future tariff exposure. The Saskatchewan farmer who discovers long-standing relationships have become unstable because uncertainty itself has become expensive. The British Columbia lumber producer watching decades of customer loyalty erode because contractors value reliability almost as much as price. To economists, tariffs can look like percentages on spreadsheets. To families, they look like canceled overtime shifts, delayed investments, hiring freezes, abandoned expansion plans. The script argues that billions of dollars in annual tariff costs were accumulating throughout the conflict. Whether every figure ultimately withstands historical scrutiny almost misses the larger point. The damage was real. The uncertainty was real. And uncertainty has a unique ability to force people into making decisions they never intended to make. That brings us to Mark Carney. Because this story isn't simply about tariffs. It's about psychology. It's about how different leaders see the same problem and arrive at completely different solutions. Most politicians think in election cycles. How do we survive the next headline? How do we dominate tomorrow's news coverage? How do we reassure voters this week? But Carney emerged from an entirely different world. He wasn't trained in campaigning. He was trained in crisis. He helped guide Canada through the global financial collapse of 2008. He later led the Bank of England through Brexit, one of the most economically uncertain periods in modern British history. He spent decades sitting in rooms where the objective wasn't to score political points. The objective was preventing systemic failure. People shaped by that environment develop unusual habits. They ask different questions. Not, how do we win this fight? But, what structural weakness allowed this fight to become dangerous in the first place? And perhaps the most uncomfortable answer facing Canada was this. Its success had become its vulnerability. For decades, Canadians celebrated their extraordinary access to the American market. Why wouldn't they? The United States represented the largest consumer economy in human history. Geographic proximity lowered transportation costs. Integrated supply chains improved efficiency. Trade agreements fostered growth. It worked beautifully. Until one day, it didn't. Because dependents feel safe only until the relationship changes. The very thing that made Canada prosperous had also concentrated its risk. If nearly 80% of your exports flow toward one customer, that customer possesses tremendous influence over your future. Not because they intend to abuse it, but because they can. And in geopolitics, capability often matters more than intention. That's when the nature of the problem changed. The challenge was no longer defeating America. The challenge was reducing exposure, not replacing one partner, expanding the list of partners. According to the narrative presented in the original script, Canada's response involved accelerating relationships with Europe, Japan, and the United Kingdom, while constructing frameworks designed to provide alternative destinations for Canadian goods and investment. If true, the brilliance wasn't aggression. It was architecture, trade architecture, economic architecture, building additional doors while preserving the original one. Because here's the truth few politicians openly admit. Negotiations are rarely determined by who talks toughest. They are determined by who has somewhere else to go. In negotiation theory, there is a concept known as BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. It sounds like something buried in a business textbook. In reality, it determines the outcome of almost every serious negotiation on Earth. If this deal collapses, what happens next? Can you survive without it? Do you have another buyer, another investor, another supplier, another ally? The stronger your alternatives, the stronger your hand. For much of this trade dispute, Canada's BATNA appeared weak. Walking away from America carried enormous consequences. Everyone understood that. Washington understood it. Ottawa understood it. Markets understood it. But alternatives are not static. They evolve, they strengthen, they mature. And if the frameworks described in this story continue developing, Canada's BATNA may look dramatically different from what it was only months earlier. That possibility changes everything, because leverage isn't an object, it's a condition, and conditions change. History offers countless examples: empires imposing restrictions on colonies, dominant corporations exploiting captive customers, industry leaders assuming competitors could never catch them. Again and again, the same mistake appears: the assumption that dependence lasts forever. Kodak assumed consumers would never abandon film. Nokia assumed competitors couldn't threaten its dominance. Blockbuster assumed convenience would always beat innovation. Each believed switching costs were too high. Each underestimated the willingness of others to adapt. Trade relationships are no different. The more pressure applied to dependent partners, the greater the incentive to diversify, the greater the incentive to innovate, the greater the incentive to endure short-term pain for long-term freedom. Perhaps that explains why one line from the original narrative resonates so deeply. We handed him the reason to build this. Whether those exact words were spoken behind closed doors almost doesn't matter, because they capture something timeless about human behavior. Pressure creates motivation. Motivation creates change. Change redistributes power. And once power is redistributed, reclaiming it becomes extraordinarily difficult. None of this means America suddenly loses. That interpretation would be both simplistic and wrong. The United States remains an economic superpower unlike any other. Its consumer market is unmatched. Its financial institutions shape global capital flows. Its technological leadership remains extraordinary. Canada cannot replace America. Europe cannot replace America. Japan cannot replace America. Britain cannot replace America. But perhaps replacement was never the objective. Maybe resilience was. Maybe the goal wasn't escaping dependence entirely. Maybe the goal was ensuring dependence never again became absolute. Because there is a profound difference between needing a partner and choosing one. The first creates vulnerability. The second creates balance. That distinction may define the next decade of North American economic history. Not divorce, not betrayal, not victory, balance. The original trade war may someday fade into history books. The tariffs themselves may eventually disappear. Political leaders will come and go. Administrations will change. Campaign slogans will be forgotten. But the lesson could endure long after the headlines vanish. Never mistake a relationship for permanent leverage. Because the moment one side begins searching for alternatives, the clock starts ticking, quietly, invisible at first, then all at once. Maybe that's why this story has captured so much attention. Not because of secret meetings, not because of dramatic speculation, but because beneath the intrigue lies a universal truth. Individuals understand it. Businesses understand it. Nations eventually learn it. The strongest position in any negotiation does not come from intimidation. It comes from having choices. The ability to say yes without fear. The ability to say no without collapse. The ability to walk away because survival no longer depends on a single path. If Canada has truly begun building that future, then the consequences will stretch far beyond this particular trade dispute. Future negotiations will unfold differently. Future alliances will carry different assumptions. Future leaders in both Ottawa and Washington will inherit a relationship transformed not by hostility, but by diversification. And perhaps years from now, historians won't remember the speeches. They won't remember the daily headlines. They won't remember the angry rhetoric dominating cable news. They may remember something far quieter. A room nobody noticed, a document signed without ceremony, a country recognizing that prosperity built through one door could become vulnerability, and deciding, before it was too late, to build several more. Because once nations discover they have options, they stop negotiating from fear. And once fear disappears, the entire game changes forever.